Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Chapter 23, Section 5, and that's the impact of the New Deal. And we're just going to be reviewing how the New Deal affected American society, not only in the 1930s, but in the decades to follow. The legacy of the New Deal has been somewhat controversial. Conservatives tend to look at this as either not having done enough to fix the economy or nowhere near as helpful as the Second World War in regards to fixing the economy. And so again, how you feel about the New Deal can tell you a lot about your politics. Many people criticized Roosevelt for being a socialist, and he even had critics from the left saying that he wasn't going far enough to fix the Great Depression. So the New Deal came to an end in 1937. By 1937, the improvement in the economy convinced many that the Depression was coming to an end. By this time, the Congress was cutting back many of the social programs that were creating these jobs. In fact, the New Deal was officially declared over by 1939. But as I said, it's left a controversial legacy. Your opinion on the New Deal may affect who you decide to vote for or support in this next campaign. For example, many conservatives say and point to the fact that the Great Depression did not officially end until World War II. The New Deal represented about $33 billion towards investment by way of relief, recovery, and reform. But conservatives would argue the Second World War represented about $338 billion, which compared to today's money, I mean, we're talking many trillions. So where the New Deal, lots of money, nothing in comparison to the amount of money spent on the war. And so while the New Deal did create tens of millions of jobs, it pales in comparison to the war itself. However, again, you can look at this from many different angles. Supporters generally point to the fact that even if it didn't wave a magic wand and fix the economy, it did help many people who were suffering to recover from their economic difficulties. Now let's look at a few of the lasting programs. Number one, the government's role did expand. Critics claimed that the New Deal, Roosevelt's power expanded greatly during the time of the Great Depression, and they are not wrong. Roosevelt benefited from having a legislature which was working closely with him, which was predominantly Democrat. Roosevelt benefited from being in office for almost 3 full terms, having appointed 7 Supreme Court justices. So the Supreme Court was very much in his favor as well. And so it's one of those few times where the federal government was working together. And so we came up with some lasting programs. The FDIC is one of these very important ones, continues to regulate the banking industry today. Your individual bank accounts are insured up to $250,000 by the federal government. And so this was created to instill confidence in the banking system. I don't worry about whether my bank will collapse because I know my account is insured. I have no reason to take my money out of the bank, nor do most Americans. The Securities and Exchange Commission continues to regulate and monitor the stock market, looking for unfair or illegal practices. As I said, the New Deal did not magically end the Great Depression. However, the relief programs do help with suffering people. The jobs programs do provide money for people to earn. And it does give hope to many. Think of the hopelessness, of the despair of being able and willing to work and provide for yourself and your family, but being unable to find work. However, the federal government did go deeply into debt from this deficit spending to create jobs and provide aid, but nowhere near the amount of debt that the federal government incurred on the massive spending on equipment and supplies for World War II, which, yes, did officially end the Great Depression. But think about it this way. If we were borrowing money to spend $33 billion, how much money were we borrowing to spend $338 billion? So again, both represent deficit spending. So many of the enduring reform laws still protect us today, such as laws setting standards on labor, like the Fair Labor Standards Act, laws banning child labor, which is why you can't get an official job until you're 16. There are a few exceptions, and I realize that, hardship exemption, so forth. But generally 16 is the year where you may begin working. The National Labor Relations Board still mediates labor disputes today. Banking and finance are still regulated through the SEC and the FDIC. Laws are enforced. However, an issue in this election is to what degree are these laws enforced, and are they still capable of monitoring the banking and financial sector in our country today? And so that question still remains. Some of the laws have been allowed to expire during the 1990s in a period known as banking deregulation. Some of the laws were changed or removed entirely, such as Glass-Steagall. And this conversation continues today of what should be done about the banking and financial sector. The question, are some banks too big to fail, is one that candidates continue to ask today. Social Security continues to be a lasting safety net. It was the first federal safety net of its kind. Safety net meaning that if you find yourself unable to work through old age or disability, you may qualify for help. This was the first of its kind. As you begin working, you will all pay into it with the expectation that it will continue to be around today. The solvency of Social Security continues to be a matter of debate. Even if you live in a very rural area, such as we do, even if you live in an agrarian area, such as we do with our apple farms and our agrarian economy in Henderson County, the Commodity Credit Corporation has benefited those of us whose livelihoods are attached to farming, which, by the way, is all of us because we have to eat. The Commodity Credit Corporation makes loans to farmers based on the amount of farmers' surplus, called parity price, meaning that the price of the loan is based on the income of the farmer. Agricultural price supports also set a precedent of federal aid to farmers. Farm subsidies are part of why farmers are able to make a living, even in difficult times. And food costs, though they don't always feel this way, are able to remain low. So parity means that the price is intended to keep the farmer's income steady. This is a form of debt repayment. It's also called income adjusted debt repayment. I was talking to Coach Frady about his student loans. They are based on the amount of money he takes in each month. The student loans subtract a small part of that from his check each month. If for some reason he makes less each month, it's a parity price, meaning it's adjusted based on his income. The New Deal had a lot to do with the environment as well. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted trees. built hiking trails, built fire lookout towers, all throughout this area. The Soil Conservation Service continues to teach farmers methods for how to preserve soil. The CCC was involved in building a number of these roads around here. You can look up and find pictures of FDR cutting the ribbon on the Blue Ridge Parkway. The Taylor Grazing Act was created to stop farmers from grazing cattle on public lands. I don't know if you heard about the recent drama from the farmers in Oregon that had seized a federal wildlife refuge. So if you heard about that, it was just resolved yesterday. They finally surrendered. They took over the compound on New Year's Eve, and they just gave up and surrendered to the authorities. One of them was killed in a shootout a few weeks ago. The rest surrendered peacefully and are now facing felony charges. The reason they claim for taking over this federal wildlife compound was that they had been brought up on charges under the Taylor Grazing Act. They had been grazing their cattle on public lands. The federal government fined them for this, and they claimed those lands were their ancestral homeland. They were also shooting animals on these public lands. They were poaching wildlife, and they were brought up on charges. And instead of facing the charges, they decided to take over this compound.
Wasn't also one thing, so I remember hearing about that they were grazing on federal land.
Yeah, that's what I mean by public land. So it was federal land, and they were grazing cattle on that land, which is a crime under the Taylor Grazing Act. And they didn't, one of their members went to jail for it, and then they decided to take matters into their own hands. Anyway, you can read about it more later. The Tennessee Valley Authority created many of the lakes around here. Kiowee, Jocassee, many of the hydroelectric dams were created by the Tennessee Valley Authority. Many of them date back to the 1930s. The government added national parks. The Great Smoky Mountains was added during the 1930s under the New Deal. Wildlife refuges, wilderness areas. Joyce Kilmer is one of the largest wilderness areas, containing one of the only tracts of unlogged timber in the southeastern United States. It's outside of Robbinsville, so go see the Joyce Kilmer Slick Rock Wilderness. Many of these wilderness areas were designated in the 1930s. The closest wilderness area to us is Shining Rock Wilderness. Wilderness areas are a special place. National Forest contains roads. You can camp most anywhere. Rules and regulations are rather slack. Wilderness areas are very strict. You cannot have any roads. You cannot have any trail signs. It can sometimes be difficult to navigate. It's easy to get lost in these areas because the rules are that these areas must remain as they are and be allowed to become wild once more. So explore them sometime. It's beautiful country, about as untouched a wilderness as you can find in our area, and many of them were created by the New Deal. But not everything was good for the environment. The New Deal funds did provide subsidies and funding for strip mining, for coal burning, and of course these things cause pollution. At this time, energy production was largely dependent on coal and mining. Obviously not too good for the environment.